Ho, before the break, you were telling us what some of the old rules of attachment were. Obviously, you wrote this book because you disagree with the way, I presume, other psychologists, other experts in your field talked about attachment styles. I want to ask you, well, I'm asking you now, how did your colleagues, because when you write a book called The New Rules of Attachment, again, first thing comes to mind for me is what were the old rules? So was there any pushback from the scientific community, by the community of experts that you work with, around this notion that there are new rules, or is this now a trend and widely accepted in psychology?
Yeah, good question. I think when I talk to some of my friends who work with people who are coming to them with attachment issues, I think by and large, they actually agree that it goes beyond the romantic relationship. But generally, how people show up is because of romantic relationships. So I think that that's where these old rules came from, is like, okay, we just have to talk about how this affects your romantic development. But I think when you really dig deep, it's like, well, what's behind that? It's because the person doesn't believe in themselves, or they have insecurities within themselves, and it's showing up in these intimate relationships. Sometimes people are coming to therapy because someone in their life is making them, and usually that person is the husband, the wife, a spouse, a longtime partner of some sort. And so I don't think that I've been getting so much pushback, but I do think that people have said, yeah, you know what, I haven't really thought about how much it just affects you integrally. It's just all about the formation of you, as opposed to how you show up in a relationship. And I also think that people aren't talking enough about how it affects you at work. I mean, there's so much impact in terms of your belief in yourself and how you believe others around you will respond, in terms of how you navigate your career and whether or not you go for it. You go for that promotion. You push yourself, you challenge yourself to do other things other than what you're doing and just being in the comfort zone. And so rather than getting a pushback, I think I'm getting more dialogue with my colleagues about, well, what is really showing up in their therapy rooms, and then how it's affecting them. Because another part of attachment is it affects your therapeutic relationships. And so that 80%, many therapists have some insecure attachment style. And it's funny because there's countertransference when certain clients are bringing up certain things. Sometimes the therapist themselves feels triggered and their attachment wounds show up. So how do you manage that? And that's a big part of the conversation as well.
And I guess along that lines, the anxious, avoidant, and those insecure attachment styles, do they tend to show up more in certain demographics? Whether it's the demographics of psychologists, or some
Mhm.
show up more in men versus women, or different ethnicities or different races. Is there any research to show, where those styles tend to show up more?
Yeah, there's less research about the different demographics, which I think would be so important and so crucial to know. But I do know that some of the research illustrates that females are more likely to be aware of their attachment styles. And so again, it's because, partially cultural cultural understanding, cultural expectations, that females are self-reflecting more, they're thinking about this more, but oftentimes it's the females who bring up attachment styles in a relationship, and the males are like, "Oh, okay, that makes sense," but maybe they hadn't thought about it up until that point. And so, the research is very limited in terms of ethnicities, in terms of maybe age ranges, but there has been a lot more research recently about how attachment shows up in the workplace, and how people can have their attachment styles show up in their interactions, especially with their supervisors and their bosses, because in some ways that's kind of like a parental figure. It's somebody that you look up to. And so then a lot of your childhood experiences with your own primary caregivers can replicate itself in the work environment.
Well, and so is it the goal, or should it be the goal of that 80% who fall into that insecure attachment style? Should it be the goal, say, of the anxious and avoidant style personalities? Should they be aspiring to become the secure attachment style?
Yeah, I think, one of the things that's important to point out is that people with insecure attachment, there is benefits to that. People who are anxiously attached, they tend to be people pleasers, but when they're not at that extreme, then they're the most helpful person you can have in your life. They're not overly people pleasing if it's not overly pathological, but they're just there. They just like want to show up for you, and they want to listen, and they're super empathetic, right? So there's all of these positive traits associated with insecure attachment too. But I think overall, secure attachment is, at least for the most part, what people would want to aim to emulate, because it is associated with the most positive mental and physical outcomes. It's associated with the most connected and important and uh and quality relationships, right? And that is going to foster your own thriving. And so I do think that there's something to be said about emulating that, but also understanding, and what you had mentioned earlier, Areva, is that most of us are not going to operate in the secure attachment style 100% of the time. Like, it's just not possible, right? But maybe 70 or 80% of the time, if you can do it, then that's wonderful. And 10 to 20% of the time, some of your insecure shadows show up. That's most people, you know? And I think when we're stressed, when we're triggered, that's when it's going to happen the most, or in an important life transition, like when you're transitioning from one job to a totally different job, when you're moving from one place to another where you have no friends, or when you're going from working to retirement. That's when a lot of people's identity crises show up. It's like, well, who am I now? And then sometimes the insecure attachment styles will show up there.
Back to the romantic relationships, I'm just thinking, since you said women tend to be more self-aware, and there is some research that suggests that maybe women are, thinking more about their attachment style than men. Is there any particular time in the relationship where you would advise, this is the right time to start talking about attachment styles? Like, there's some rules about when you should talk about marriage or having kids or maybe moving
Yeah.
in together. There's this notion that you don't want to, like, on the first date, overwhelm someone, may cause that person to get nervous. Like, oh my God, this person is desperate or needy or too thirsty. Is there any time in the romantic relationship when it's okay to start
Yeah.
evaluating the attachment style of your partner?
Yeah, you know what? I think it shows up in the first few dates. So even if you're not actually having the conversation, I think you can kind of tell. I mean, as I'm looking back in my own life, in my own dating experiences, I mean, there was people who were people pleasers from day one, right? And then there were the people who had 2 or 3 awesome dates with you, and then they'll just disappear. They'll go away for 2 weeks, and they'll come back and act like nothing's happened and call you want to go out again. That's probably like an avoid an attachment style right there. So I think you can get some observations in quite early on, but I think when you're going to have the conversation, that's when you're getting serious with the person, to really have it out and say, hey, you know what? In my childhood, I think I developed an anxious attachment style out of it, or I'm a little bit avoidant. That's just the way I've coped in my life. Those are, I think, the kind of conversations that you would have when you're getting more serious about the person, when you're really evaluating, is this going to be a long-term partner for me? Right. It's kind of in line with the conversations you would have when you're starting to think about, hey, do you want to have children? Like, how do you handle your finances? Like, do you think this is leading to marriage? Is that something you even want? I think it's along the lines of that, but you will definitely see behaviors that will show you what kind of attachment style the person is having pretty early on. It's pretty apparent in most people.
I want to ask you, if you start to see some of those signs that a person has an attachment style that were not seeking, or one that you purposely said you would try to avoid, but yet you start to see the signs in that person, is that a red flag that, you should try to avoid? Should you run? Should you end the relationship immediately? Or do you recommend that people hang in there and try to work through it, even though they've said, hey, my next relationship, I'm not dealing with anyone with an avoidant
Mhm.
personality or a style? When we come forward, we'll get
Yep.
your response to that, because I know a lot of times you meet people and they're not necessarily what you were hoping for. And that's always the big question. Do I try to make this work, or, should I just move on? Stay with us. We're talking to triple board certified and licensed psychologist, Dr. Judy Ho, about her new book, The New Rules of Attachment.